very much for inviting me here to this conference. Carol, I share the same issue here. I would have liked a stool, so I hope you all can see me. I'm a little bit on the shorter side. But I'm very excited to be able to talk about national pharmacare and international trade considerations. And I think there's been a lot of discussion about trade, particularly because we have seen new agreements arise in the past. And I'm going to take a few minutes to walk through the history of those agreements and where we are today, and then potentially speculate on what this means to us as an industry, and somehow tie it back to pharmacare. So I will say, just before going forward, is that I do work for Allergan, but all the views that I'm planning on expressing today are all my own. They don't represent Allergan. I have a CEO who does like to talk very vocally about trade, pricing, and pharma. This has nothing to do with it. This is fully my own. So please expect that disclaimer from me. So going forward, Canada, it's not surprising that they've had a very ambitious trade agenda over the coming years. It certainly has been in the news lately, and in particular, when we look at the USMCA agreement, it shows how important trade is to us as a country that roughly has about 35 million people. In the last few years, we've seen increased activity with trade agreements, including the agreement with Europe, with CETA in 2016, and also with the Asia-Pacific region. Our industry is impacted in various ways by these agreements. And intellectual property, or IP issues, often receive the greatest headlines. And I guess we might say for good reason, based on our system. But I would like to suggest that these modern agreements include more than that we need to consider. And those would be the regulatory cooperation and the procedural fairness, which I think is a backdrop as we go forward that we might find ourselves much more engaged in as an industry. So issues of drug pricing and reimbursement can also be impacted. But what I'd like to do today is explore how they can be impacted. How do we connect the dots between these very complex agreements and an equally complex debate about drug coverage, pharmacare, which continues to advance in Canada? So taking a step back, we do know that these trade agreements have often been enhancements for our industry. They've been a fundamental source of improvement to Canada's IP regime for our industry. This goes back to the original free trade agreement between Canada and the US in the 1980s. The FTA ended compulsory licensing and gave us a system of patent linkage, which has also been commonly referred to as the PM&OC regulations. However, Canada agreeing to strengthen IP was also counterbalanced by the creation of the Patent Medicines Price Review Board, the PMPRB, as a means of consumer protection. So this should be our first notice that when we do get enhanced IP, we do need to expect something in return for the government to act. In the coming years, NAFTA and the WHO also gave us additional obligations to enact a system of clinical data exclusivity, which we formally adopted a decade later in 2006. That was a long time coming, but certainly a critical advance for our industry. CETA, which is the recent trade agreement with Europe in 2016, gave innovators a right of appeal in patent linkage disputes with generic companies. So before this change, generic companies that had a successful patent challenge on an innovative product had the ability to sell immediately after. In other developed markets, innovative companies had the opportunity to request a stay or a pause, which allowed that innovative company to challenge that decision, challenge the lower court decision in a higher court. So certainly this was a step forward for us as an innovative industry to protect and to fight back. And it's only taken us one step forward, though, to align with the US and with Europe. CETA also gave us patent term restoration. It's also referred to as the Certificates of Supplementary Protection, which again has long existed in Europe and the US. This allows companies compensation for effective patent life loss due to regulatory delays or clinical development. And if we look at many of the products that we're currently developing today, these are very lengthy in process and takes much time to bring a product to market. So while these improvements are important for our industry, they have taken a long time for these benefits to be recognized. And just a few weeks ago, Canada agreed to provide 2 additional years of data protection only for biologics in the USMCA agreement that was updating for NAFTA. The next step, though, is for the agreement to be adopted. So when Canada adopts this agreement, which should hopefully happen in 2019, that's Canada's commitment to engage in a change in regulations within a 5-year time frame. So while we see these are improvements, this is looking at affecting biologics in 2024. It's important to underline then how critical a strong and stable IP system is to our industry. It's a very real competitiveness issue for Canada as we work within our organizations to secure funding, product launches, and support for investments and partnerships. So I think it's fair to comment and to suggest that the perception of drug cost burdens are far more influential in the minds of government today, and that's recently evidenced by the creation of the PCPA and the national pharmacare debate. I think we as innovative companies need to do a better job in communicating the value that we bring to our society, that we bring to our health, and to remind everyone about the industry's cycle of innovation, including the research, the clinical trials, and the importance of a timely global launch for our new products. We certainly all want Canada to remain competitive and not fall behind. IP protection for our industry can thus often be positioned by Canada as a give in exchange for something else, which is often agriculture, public procurement, dispute resolution. But it's certainly not what the government of Canada is asking for. I should also note that when Canada does agree to do something, the implementation can really matter. It's been observed by many in our industry that Canada's choices on implementing the patent term restoration by specifying new requirements after the fact that were not included in the CETA agreement certainly lessened its potential impact to our industry. And I believe we need to remain vigilant as we look to the implementation of the USMCA. So beyond IP, I did comment on some of the other aspects that these agreements bring forward for us. Transparency and procedural fairness are certainly something that we need to keep an eye on. Some have suggested that the systems and procedures of other jurisdictions are too unpredictable and opaque. It benefits all parties to understand what the requirements are, and I think we heard that in earlier presentations today. We need to understand what the market potential is and the potential uptake of a product could be in our market to attract new investors and to bring new products to Canada. We do not want delays in patient access to cause many of our patients to not receive the treatments that they certainly require. But Canada and many other jurisdictions will fight hard to ensure that trade obligations don't limit their decision of what to pay for and how to organize their health system. Intuitively, we know how sensitive this healthcare debate is for Canadians, especially in any conversation in response to the United States. Our politicians and government officials know this as well and certainly act accordingly, and we've seen this in newspaper articles and in the media to date. So even when agreeing to enhance the IP in the USMCA agreement, Canada was sure to retain their ability to organize and manage its health system as it sees fit. Some of the language is clearly positive and helpful, but I don't think we should read into anything further than what's actually written down. It is what it is. So IP changes in trade agreements are important in their own right, and as I've tried to highlight briefly here, our industry has secured many positive improvements over time as a direct result of international discussions. IP also matters, though, to us because of what it causes the government and jurisdictions to take action on. Governments will certainly look for new avenues and new tools to deal with anticipated cost increases or cost pressures. And again, I'd bring forward the PMPRB here as the greatest example of something that was brought in when IP protection was increased. And I am personally very concerned that the current effort to engage the government on a more balanced and productive reform of the PMPRB will be yet again complicated by our recent agreement to add 2 years for biologics in the USMCA. Justified or not, this is a nagging temptation to view our industry as a zero-sum basis. And from the minds of the government, when they give us something, we need to be prepared to understand that they will take back equally or more so. And this is what we've learned over the years. There's also evident fear or misunderstanding on the part of many stakeholders about what our pipelines hold and what value that we would bring forward. And I think it's very important for all of us to reach out to our governments, our stakeholders, our public payers, our private insurers, and our patient groups so that they recognize what we hold in our pipelines and what value we hope to bring to Canadians as a society as a whole. And I think this needs to start taking a stronger stance in the discussions that we take place more publicly. So if I were to move to our key takeaways, I think that trade agreements have certainly been a key driver to be more globally competitive for us as an industry here in Canada. And because of that, I think that it will certainly increase the investment that we do see in Canada. It sends a message to the world that we're open, that we want more investment, and we're willing to take a step forward. I think the other thing to note, though, is that Canada has been very deliberate in ensuring maximum flexibility to manage its health system, including drug pricing and access decisions. Trade agreements place a focus on transparency and process. And I think if I were to ask any of our colleagues, they would say, of course, the PCPA, CADTH, PCODER, and INESS, and all of the drug programs will send us the details of their processes and procedures that they choose to follow and the checklists. I'm not sure that's the same as being transparent and being open, but it's certainly something that we need to work towards improving. So pharmacare is not directly related to trade agreements, including the recent USMCA. The perception created by those agreements can serve as an encouragement, though, to those developing policy from a position of ideological commitment or misplaced fear of the future. And I think this is our place to stand up and to stop the concern that people have and share the benefits that our industry brings. Finally, it's clear that governments have an easier time tallying up costs associated with drug spending than what our industry brings. The responsibility for that state of affairs, unfortunately or fortunately, rests with us here in the room and many of us who work in our industry. We do have to listen. We do have to do a better job of telling our stories, including value up front, not just about the safety and efficacy of our products. We need to talk about how that benefit is brought to to Canadians and society as a whole. And I think we really do need to engage much more strongly in the policy discussions. Things like PMPRB and the changes that we may be expecting in the early part of 2019, but also on the national pharmacare debate. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important for us to not lose sight of the root of the problem of where this all started. Those debates are not going away soon. So the faster that we can step forward and engage in meaningful discussions with our stakeholders at all levels of government will allow us as an industry to move forward. So thank you very much for your time.